The Benjamin Netanyahu government greenlights a plan to sanction the country's oldest newspaper. Haaretz is accused of hurting the state through its critical coverage of the war on Gaza. Dan Perry is the former chair of the Foreign Press Association of Israel and a former regional editor of the Associated Press news agency in Europe, the Middle East and Africa. The Israeli government has accused Haaretz of supporting terrorism and undermining the Israeli state. Do you believe that that is what the media outlet has done?
Well, of course not. Obviously not. Haaretz simply is the most clear voice of journalistic opposition to the government of Netanyahu. And it is about more than just the particular conduct of the war in Gaza, the essence of which, by the way, the Haaretz editorial team mostly supports. The particularities are something else. Haaretz has been critical of everything about the Netanyahu coalition, including the year or so that they were trying to essentially Putinize the country before the war even began, a time during which the security chiefs of Israel had warned Netanyahu that the schism they were creating would invite attack and bring about the war, and they were, of course, ignored. Haaretz is simply an opposition newspaper, and the government of Netanyahu is akin to their illiberal equivalents in places like Hungary, in a worst case, even Turkey. Not entirely unlike, the Russia regime under Putin 20 years ago when they were merely authoritarian and not yet fully dictatorial. As such, they try to portray the critical media as somehow enemies of the people, enemies of the state. They're going to try to fight it. And when a person like Amos Shokin goes a bit too far and says things and uses vocabulary that I'm sure he now regrets, they pretend to be shocked. But in fact, they're happy because it helps them to delegitimize critical voices in the press.
Haaretz has denounced the action, saying it's an attack on democracy. Many others have said the same. Is that how you see it?
Oh, absolutely. But it's no surprise. As I said before, this particular government is the spiritual kin of other governments across the world that are democratically elected, but believe in a version of democracy that is purely about essentially dictatorship of the majority. They are no fans of the trappings of liberal democracy that include many, many things, including the right of the minority, the right of the political minority to speak its mind. Now, they're not going to ban Haaretz. They're trying to do it damage, and also they're trying to sort of circle the wagons of their own constituents and sort of project to them that they're doing something that is part and parcel of the cultural war, essentially, far, far broader than the issue of the Palestinians. And look, I mean, the noises they're making about the enemies of the state, I mean, this is stuff that you hear also from the Trumpist crowd in the U.S. This is a movement of the populist right around the world, and the Netanyahu government is one of the leading lights of that movement. Will it really harm Haaretz? I'm not so sure. I don't have the data on their revenue, but one should remember that this is one of the world's relatively few papers that is very successful with its paywall, and they charge a lot of money. I mean, it's a fairly small number of global legacy newspapers that can do this, and we're talking about the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, the Financial Times. Haaretz is in that zone, and I would not be at all surprised if this war on their revenue, on the advertising side of the revenue, backfires, because I know plenty of people who, for example, have a weekly subscription to Haaretz, and that includes myself, who are now considering making it daily, even though they really don't need the daily printout. They're going to do that just to make a point.
Once you have Ben-Gvir and Smotrich sitting in the cabinet and deciding to close down Haaretz, I think that this is something that if you would have told me this 10 years ago, I would ask you what kind of drugs you take.
We keep talking about, guys, we keep talking about closing down Haaretz. That is not what's currently happening. They're trying to harm Haaretz, and they're doing it in a way that is, I believe, illegitimate, in a way that confuses the state with the government. Companies that are funded by the state are not owned by the government, and they're crossing that line. Interestingly, perhaps the most the media organ in Israel that is most credited with being a little bit like Haaretz on the broadcast side is Channel 11, which is the state broadcaster, a little bit analogous to BBC. So it is no surprise that the same communication minister, Harry, mentioned earlier in this program, is also targeting the state broadcaster looking for ways to privatize them, and maybe down the road, if no buyer is found, no billionaire friend of Netanyahu buyer is found, maybe to shut them down. It's
Okay.
not quite as ham-fisted as Erdogan would do it, shutting them down tomorrow. But they're certainly at war with critical media.
The way that the Israeli military and government controls their access to Gaza, as we mentioned before, it uses this to restrict the movements of journalists. Many international news outlets have criticised this, saying that they don't get a fair understanding, a true understanding of what is happening in Gaza. I mean, how successful has the Israeli military been, though, in trying to control that narrative of exactly what is happening in Gaza on the international stage, do you think?
Well, not very successful at all, because it tends to backfire, leaving the door wide open for merely the perspective of people in Gaza, many of whom may actually be propagandists. It's very foolish. The Foreign Press Association in Israel has actually appealed, and I've discussed this on other media on numerous occasions. They've appealed this basically near blanket ban on foreign journalists being allowed into Gaza. It's complex because, of course, the security argument is not spurious. It's incredibly dangerous, and the last thing they want is even more people killed because they were allowed into a war zone. Look, I am not a person who thinks that Israel targets journalists because they're journalists. There's a number of arguments to the contrary. One says basically that many of these journalists are not really journalists, but something entirely different, posing as journalists. Another argument says that pure Hamas sometimes drive around in press trucks. Now, I can't prove or disprove it, but I certainly know they're not above it. A third issue is when we talk about the huge number of journalists, of course, the definition of a journalist has been changed dramatically in the past 10 years or so with social media. My two daughters can claim to be journalists. I mean, everyone's posting everything all the time, and that may affect the large numbers as well. Putting aside the fact that the death toll in Gaza has just been horrific. So the numbers are so high, or at least if the numbers that are reported that Israel doesn't deny are so high, then people of every profession are going to be killed just as a random sample. It's a horrifying situation. I'm not sure there's a very clear case of right and wrong. Certainly, Israel should be projecting less indifference to it. The fact that it appears that something horrible may be happening is something that they should treat, at the very least, beyond the morality of it, as a public relations emergency. And of course, they're not. And that has to do not with the military, but with this government that is not just incompetent on public diplomacy, but, as I say, part of an authoritarian global cabal that is not friendly to journalism in general.
Many of our Al Jazeera colleagues have been killed doing the best they can, given the circumstances, and doing incredibly brave work.
Legitimate journalists in Gaza are to be praised and to be admired, no doubt about it. I'm just saying it's a complex picture.
Indeed. It is an incredibly complex picture. I don't think anyone's going to argue at that point.
I hope against hope that Haaretz is not closed down. But even if it were, I feel certain that people with the skills of journalists and a critical frame of mind would continue to find ways to get news out, and to hope that a point will come where Israel is able to, the Israeli government is able to embrace a free, liberal, diverse media that reflects all the many opinions in that country.
Indeed. OK, we'll have to leave it there, but we really do appreciate your insight. Akiva, Tim and Dan, thanks very much for joining us here on Inside Story. And thank you, too, for watching.